Almost every civilization in recorded history has believed in witches and their supernatural power to do great harm. For centuries, they were persecuted by the thousand. In the Middle Ages, it was believed witches were behind a horrifying illness that regularly struck their communities. Fevered nightmares, sick animals, dying children. It was known as bewitchment. The mystery of this strange affliction, which prompted so many executions, may have been cracked by scientist Linda Capparel.
As I was starting to work through this jigsaw of evidence, I felt like a detective. I was on a great sleuthing project, and every time some piece of evidence fell into place, I was so excited.
Her detective work may also have unearthed the true culprit behind an ancient murder mystery. A man hacked to death over 2,000 years ago. And the biggest clue, an infamous hallucinogenic drug from our time. For 3 dark centuries, witch persecution reached epidemic proportions. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, over 40,000 innocent men, women, and children were sent to their deaths across Europe. The Vatican sent out a decree warning people of bewitchment. In England, witch-finders hunted down suspected witches. One hauled 250 before the courts in just 2 years. Witchcraft was a crime punishable by death. One of the most brutal cases of witch persecution took place here in 1589 at the manor house in the village of Warboys near Cambridge. Doctors and church leaders had been called to diagnose a mystery illness that had struck down the 5 little daughters of the well-to-do Throckmorton family and 7 of their maidservants. To them, the illness bore all the hallmarks of witchcraft.
There were a number of doctors who were extremely skeptical about witchcraft, but who were willing to come to the conclusion that a disease was caused by witchcraft or by demonic possession after all other available explanations had failed. It was one of the things that they had in their diagnostic armory.
Folklore said that a witch could send out her familiars, animal spirits, to bewitch the weak and force them to make a pact with the devil. The sick showed all the classic symptoms of bewitchment. They were plagued by hellish visions, often of wild animals. One of them imagined she saw a cat tearing her skin from her flesh. The girls' bodies also went into violent fits as, bent double, they writhed in agony on their beds. A diagnosis of witchcraft meant one thing. Someone totally innocent would have to take the blame. In Warboys, a local misfit, Alice Samuel, was singled out. In England, it was standard practice to torture a witch. They were often branded, mutilated, or held underwater, struggling for breath. Any method to see the curse of bewitchment lifted was considered totally acceptable. Alice Samuel was no exception.
Another thing which they believed at the period was if you scratched a witch to draw blood, that would again alleviate the suffering of the person who was allegedly bewitched. And this does happen to her. This is a form of physical maltreatment that she is subjected to on several occasions.
After a year of continuous pressure, she confessed. In England, we did not burn our witches at the stake. We let them die slowly at the gallows. Alice Samuel was hanged. For good measure, they hanged her husband and daughter too. By 16th century standards, it was an open and shut case. Ignorant of the truth, doctors and church leaders repeatedly gave bewitchment a supernatural cause. But the mystery of what was really behind the symptoms has never been cracked. Until today. The strongest evidence lies here in Salem, in the heart of New England, one of the original settlements on the east coast of America. It's a major tourist trap now, but it was the scene of the Salem witch trials, the single most dramatic episode of witch persecution, made famous by Arthur Miller's stage play and movie, The Crucible. Exactly the same symptoms were seen here 100 years after the Alice Samuel case in England, only with far more disastrous consequences. In 1692, 150 people were imprisoned and 19 men and women were executed for witchcraft.
In my view, the people who were hanged during the Salem witch trials were heroes because they probably could have saved their lives by confessing. Every account that exists say they went very bravely, they didn't beg for mercy, they didn't complain, they didn't, nothing. They just took their fate. And I think that's extraordinarily brave, extraordinarily brave. I can't imagine such dignity and such firmness of faith.
Salem was one of the first Puritan settlements. The colonists had only just arrived from Britain, and they brought with them all their old superstitions. They were intensely religious, and when things went wrong, it was to the church that they looked for guidance.
People spent a lot of time in church. It wasn't just a half hour, it was a long session, morning and afternoon. And this was the key to how they lived. And so anything that seemed to be aberrant in that society had to be addressed right away and fixed. It was a very intense way to live, I believe, and anything could throw it into a turmoil. They had no knowledge of science as would happen in the 18th century. So, for instance, a storm might be interpreted as a sign of God's displeasure, or a crop failure, a drought, that sort of thing.
So when in December 1691, after a particularly harsh winter, a number of the settlers were struck down by a horrifying illness, they were convinced that the devil had stepped out of the wings. They suffered from exactly the same symptoms seen in Britain, violent convulsions or fits. They would writhe around in agony, screaming in terror. Their skin felt like it was being pricked all over by pins, and they were tormented by haunting visions of wild animals. As more and more became sick, people began to panic. They were desperate for an explanation. The town doctor provided it: witchcraft. For nearly a year, 8 afflicted young girls became the most powerful force in Salem. A court was convened where they testified they had been bewitched. In front of the townspeople, they convulsed and wailed at the visions of wild animals that they were convinced had been sent out by witches to attack them. In the space of 9 months, 150 so-called witches had been singled out, arrested, and thrown into prison. Each was presented with a simple choice: confess or face execution. 19 chose to die.
It became pretty clear that you were going to be found guilty unless you confessed. And if you confessed, you were committing a crime against God, which would be even worse than dying. I can't imagine anything worse than being accused of something you didn't do and knowing you'd never be able to prove your innocence.
But now, a major revelation has come from original research on the Salem witch trials. The symptoms that sparked the execution of innocent men and women here and in Britain may have had a perfectly rational, physical cause. Professor Linda Capparel is a New York-based behavioral psychologist. When she first began her investigation into Salem, she accepted the conventional belief that there was no physical reason for their illness, that the 8 girls were simply malicious and had faked the whole thing.
The conventional explanation with Salem was that it was psychological. The girls were described by one historian as a pack of bobby soxers on the loose. They were trying to become the center of attention. And from this grew hysteria that spread throughout the community.
But for Professor Capparel, something just didn't fit. The girls may have been occasionally mischievous, but their illness was so severe, they couldn't have faked every symptom.
Clearly there is some faking of hallucinations. There is some faking of convulsions. But the original afflictions and the descriptions of the afflictions could not have been faked. People described a black thing comes into the room, and the thing has the body of a monkey and the legs and the claws of a rooster, and has a face that looks something like a man. The convulsions that are described are so horrible. One description has a girl that is convulsing so badly that her head is almost touching her heels. The forms of these convulsions literally wrench the body.
She studied the symptoms that had driven the Salem witch trials. To simply say it was only the 8 girls who were plagued by nightmare visions was wrong. The visions tormented people all over the village.
It wasn't just the girls who were experiencing hallucinations. Other people in the community, men as well as women, were hallucinating or reported hallucinations and making accusations.
The evidence was there in the trial records.
I saw a woman coming towards us, about 16 or 20 pole from us, but did not know who it was. My wife could not see her. When I did get up on my horse again, to my understanding, there stood a cow where I saw the woman.
What could induce the kind of hallucinations seen in Salem and in Britain came to her in a flash of inspiration. It was the most unexpected of explanations.
One evening I was studying with a friend, and I was rereading another historian's account of the Salem events. And there was something in the paragraph that I was reading that just made me think, this could be associated with LSD.
LSD, more popularly known as acid, is a drug with extraordinary hallucinogenic properties. It attained notoriety in the 60s as the psychedelic potion of the flower power generation, which sprung out of the Haight-Ashbury community in San Francisco. The signature of LSD is that it can send you on hallucinogenic acid trips. These hallucinatory states could be heavenly or a living nightmare.
As a student, I lived in Haight-Ashbury, and knowledge about LSD was very common. People described having hallucinations. They would see plants turning into animals. They would see walls dripping with blood or dripping with different colors. They reported lights that were wavy in form and undulating. Stomach ache, strange sensations in their heads. And I was struck by the similarity between some of the things that I was reading and things that I'd heard years before as a student.
While the bewitched settlers of Salem may have been suffering from something like this, a bad acid trip, surely they had no access to LSD. Or did they? For centuries, a strange illness known as bewitchment had been exploited as hard proof of witchcraft in Britain and in Salem. Now a new twist on the story had found the key symptom, nightmare hallucinations, were exactly like LSD-style acid trips. And it was symptoms like these that had been the driving force behind the deaths of innocent people.
In time, the people in Salem began to haunt me, the people who were executed, and I would dream of them. And it would seem that at times when I just thought, this story is too hard to put together, the research is too hard, I'd still feel compelled to move ahead. It was always, for me, not just a detective story, but it was a story about the people that had died there.
But how could the inhabitants of Salem have had access to a drug like LSD? Her investigation drew her to the strange findings of Swiss scientist Albert Hofmann, who had made an extraordinary discovery in 1943. He was a neurophysiologist, and he had been experimenting with a naturally growing substance, a fungus called ergot. Ergot had long been known to contain various chemicals, and Hofmann had been working with these in the hope of finding useful medical applications. He had made an extract of the ergot fungus. By mistake, he had spilt some of it on his hand, which must have seeped into his skin. Within hours, he began to hallucinate. Colors became intensely vivid. Familiar shapes seemed distorted. He had derived LSD from ergot. A discovery that would shoot him to medical fame and give him a godlike status with the hippie. Professor Capparel now had a suspect in her sights, ergot, a natural fungus capable of producing LSD-style hallucinations. She consulted a medical friend to see whether the symptoms of ergot poisoning matched up with the symptoms seen in Salem.
I said to my friend, do you have anything that is like a pharmacological encyclopedia? He was a pre-med student, so this wasn't such a bizarre question to ask him. And it was almost as if the description in the pharmacological reference had been taken from the trial records themselves. It was just extraordinary. And that for me was a real eureka moment.
Albert Hofmann had discovered LSD decades before, but Professor Capparel decided to put her new theory to the great scientist anyway.
I wrote him a letter suggesting to him what my hypothesis was, and he wrote me back and he said, well, it sounds plausible. It wasn't a long letter, but certainly he answered the question that I needed him to answer.
It was a good hunch, but there was a problem. If ergot was behind the hallucinations, how had the settlers of Salem come into contact with the fungus in the first place? She came across a pivotal piece of evidence. It wasn't just people who were affected, it was the animals as well.
My husband, Benjamin Abbott, had not only been afflicted in his body, as he testifies, but also that strange and unusual things has happened to his cattle, for some have died suddenly and strangely, which we could not tell any natural reason for. Men were sick, babies were dying, animals in the community were acting strangely, and people were concerned about the odd behaviors there. So it begins to look like something that could be in the food source, but it's got to be something that both people and animals would be consuming, which would suggest going towards grain.
Grain was the primary food source in Salem, and it was harvested from their dominant cereal crop, rye. It fed both the people and the farm animals. But how could a fungus like ergot contaminate the rye fields? Professor Maurice Moss has made a lifelong study of poisonous fungi.
Here's an ergot, and that little black thing there, do you see? Sticking out there. Rye and barley are the two main food crops, but there are about 17 other genera of grasses that are infected by ergot. When the fungus germinates in its host, it will use the plant's own nutrients as its nutrients and will gradually replace the material of the developing grass seed with its own material. And you can see it looks rather like a seed. It's replaced a seed.
It seemed the ergot fungus could have infected the rye fields in Salem. If it did, the bread that settlers made from the grain would also be contaminated with poisonous chemicals from the ergot.
These structures are also packed with a group of compounds called alkaloids. These are acutely poisonous. They will kill if you consume enough of them, but they have all sorts of other effects as well. Some of the natural alkaloids undoubtedly have hallucinogenic properties. The ergot alkaloids are nerve toxins, very complex, very diverse, but all of them have in common that they are nerve toxins.
In key cases of bewitchment in Britain, there is not only a description of hallucinations, but also other horrific symptoms. A pin-pricking sensation, like insects crawling under the skin. But more importantly, fits so powerful that the sick could barely be held down. Professor Capparel found accounts of exactly the same symptoms in the Salem trial records.
We were conversant with Benjamin Holton for above a week before he died, and he was acted in a very strange manner with most violent fits, and he died a most violent death. And the doctor that was with him said he could not tell what his distemper was.
If she was right, these symptoms would have to be the work of ergot as well. Cutting-edge research being done by pharmacologists in Holland shows how ergot could cause convulsions. Their research centers on an ergot toxin called ergotamine, which they are using in the treatment of migraine.
Ergot alkaloids have, in general, a vasoconstrictor action. They constrict smooth muscles of not all places, smooth muscles in the blood vessel. We found that ergotamine has a very selective action on the blood vessels in this region.
A simple experiment on live human tissue reveals how ergot may have produced the violent fits. tiny 6mm pieces of artery are mounted on 2 steel hooks and placed in a tissue bath. When a minute amount of ergotamine, the ergot toxin, is dropped into the tissue bath, its extraordinary constrictive power is revealed. Within seconds, the toxin causes the piece of tissue to seize up, pulling the 2 steel hooks closer together.
What this experiment shows that ergotamine has that constrictive power on the blood vessels, will reduce the blood supply, will have a constrictor effect also in the chest region, and also reduce the blood supply to the brain, can lead to convulsions, hallucination, and symptoms of that kind.
The climbing needle charts the effect on the piece of artery as the toxin takes hold. A person would uncontrollably convulse as the brain is starved of oxygen, and the skin draining of blood would cause the pricking sensation. Could this be what was witnessed in Salem 300 years ago?
They look like to me that there is a possibility, or there is a strong possibility, that they could have had ergot poisoning.
In her quest to discover what was behind the bewitchment of Salem, Professor Capparel had found her prime suspect. The challenge now was to place it at the scene of the crime. Ergot will thrive in wet, damp soil. Her research showed that in Salem in 1691, the farmers planted their rye crop in low, marshy ground.
The colonists had favorite places for growing rye. They liked nice, swampy meadows, which is not only good for growing rye and growing grain, but it's also good for promoting conditions that are conducive to ergot.
But there was still a major hurdle. The weather conditions have to be exactly right for ergot to contaminate entire fields of rye. For a mass infection of Salem's rye harvest in the months leading up to the witch trials, there had to have been a warm, wet spring and summer. The chance discovery of a diary written by one of the court magistrates turned up the goods.
I did not think that I would be able to find weather patterns. After all, it was a long time. And just by chance, I stumbled upon a reproduction of Samuel Sewall's diary. And he recorded the weather in there for 1691 and 1692, which were the 2 critical years. 1691 was a warm, wet spring with a stormy, wet summer. And that is the year when this ergotized grain would have to have been growing.
She made another important discovery from the trial records. The vast majority of reports of sickness were confined to one side of Salem.
In the village itself, amongst the western half of the village, people were reporting spontaneous abortion, hallucinations, choking, pinching, convulsions, strange behavior. There was a very odd pattern.
It actually made perfect sense. She discovered the western farms were the swampy marshlands, exactly the kind of spot ergot was most likely to grow. But rye wasn't only grown in Salem, and it certainly wasn't the only area of the world that was marshy and wet. It had been a staple crop in parts of Britain and across Europe for centuries. Ergot had to be infecting Europe as well. If it was, could this help explain the waves of witch persecution that saw 40,000 suspected witches killed in the Middle Ages? Outbreaks of an affliction with very similar symptoms to ergot poisoning were periodically recorded across Europe under several different names. St. Anthony's Fire, St. Vitus' Dance, and the evil writhing. It tended to hit the poor, weaker peasant classes the hardest. It was their rye bread that was most likely to be contaminated by ergot.
It doesn't take much imagination to think how a society which had not only no antibiotics, but really no medical knowledge or help available to the vast majority of its population would deal with an outbreak of contaminated food, and just to see how quickly, rapidly and disastrously that could spread.
With no pesticides to kill the fungus, it was the peasant population that was especially in danger of attack from ergotism. It struck hard at those with the poorest diet.
If one's talking in the case of something like ergotism, which attacks people with low disease resistance, and particularly with low vitamin A, I would have thought the average medieval peasant was very susceptible to such attacks.
It's hardly surprising that word would spread about these terrifying cases of ergot poisoning around Britain and across Europe. After that, any illness that had even vaguely similar symptoms would then be falsely attributed to bewitchment.
These cases become paradigms. People write about them at the time. The knowledge of them then travels around. It might well travel, even across the Atlantic, perhaps, into the New World. It certainly travels through chapbooks, through ballads, and through learned treatises. So these things take on a tremendous importance.
If outbreaks of ergot poisoning were prevalent, did they coincide with the rash of witch executions across Europe? It was Professor Mary Matosian who made the startling discovery.
I got into Europe because I had to account for the fact that witchcraft persecution happens in certain years and not others, in certain places, not others. So I had to cover the map to make sure I wasn't missing something.
The witch trials that ravaged Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries were localized in very specific areas, as shown here. In Britain, the great witch hunts were centered around Essex and East Anglia. Matosian discovered that the areas where witch trials and executions took place did coincide with the major rye-growing regions. But not only that, in that 200-year period, the weather conditions in Western Europe were different from today. They were perfect for the formation of ergot on rye. Of course, the only way to prove that ergot poisoning was being misinterpreted as bewitchment would be to conduct blood tests and tissue samples on the body of a supposedly bewitched person. We can't test the girls from Salem or from Britain. But there is one body that we can test. Strangely, one that is nearly 2,000 years older. The peat bog body, known as Grauballer Man. The symptoms of ergot poisoning are a perfect match for the symptoms of bewitchment. But the theory that ergot was the true culprit behind witchcraft has been hampered by the lack of supporting medical evidence. Now all that's about to change. Grauballer Man is one of the infamous peat bog bodies, men and women mysteriously buried in bogs in the Iron Age, when druids and mystics ruled over a supernatural realm of gods and demons. He was lifted from his swampy tomb only 50 years ago.
It was a fine day in April in 1952 where the peat cutters, they went for work in a small bog 20 kilometers west of Moesgaard. And it wasn't long until they suddenly had to stop because they realized that There was something strange in the peats, and it looked like a human body. The skin was as if he was just from yesterday.
This was no ordinary archaeological find. He had been murdered in a frenzied way, with a knife and with a club, then dumped naked into the bog.
The first thing we could see was that he had a cut ear to ear across the throat. It even went through the esophagus and left a big gap also between the third and the fourth vertebra. That, of course, must have killed him, but there were also other signs. He had received a powerful blow to his right temple, and which caused the skull to crack.
It was obvious that his murderers had gone to great lengths to see that he didn't live. It was possible his executioners hunted him down and killed him because they thought he was bewitched or possessed by demons. A motive like this would explain the ferocity with which he was slaughtered, not just with the blunt instrument that fractured his skull, but also the knife that slit his throat. A post-mortem was conducted just after he was found in the bog back in 1952. An important discovery was made which had no significance then, but today may explain why he was murdered. An investigation under the microscope of his stomach contents revealed his last meal was largely comprised of ergot.
We were very lucky to have a rather big amount of stomach content from the Grauballermann, and it showed a huge composition of cereals and wheats and small fragments of bone from pork. And during the analysis, they found a huge amount of ergot.
These two jam jars contain what's left of his stomach contents. Though ergot was found in the gut, there was no evidence that the ergot alkaloids, the toxins produced by the fungus, had got into his bloodstream. Only if they had, would Grauballermann definitely be suffering from the classic symptoms of bewitchment, the convulsions and hallucinations that could have been the reason for his murder.
We don't know whether they had reached the gut wall, there to be absorbed into the bloodstream and transported to the brain and have their effects symptomatically. Obviously, we couldn't determine that from looking at these things microscopically, but this is where we need chemical analysis.
Channel 4 has been granted permission to use a tiny, precious piece of his gut lining for chemical tests. If traces of the ergot alkaloids can be found in the gut sample, then we will have the strongest evidence possible that he was suffering from convulsions and hallucinations at the time of his murder, the same symptoms that for centuries were thought to be bewitchment. The test, while simple, is a long shot. It will be highly significant if after all this time, even the tiniest trace of the alkaloids is present in the gut. A process known as chromatography will split the various chemicals from his gut into a tiny ladder of colored bars. This has to be compared alongside a similar test done on a modern sample of ergot. If the poisonous ergot alkaloids have been absorbed into his gut, they will show up on the paper as blue.
So here is the chromatogram from the gut extracts, and we have got at least one compound here giving a bluey colour, and we know that there are some alkaloids from ergot that give this colour with this reagent.
Right. So that would fit basically with at least one component of ergot surviving these 2,000 years, or
possibly
a compound related to what we find in ergot.
Yes, that's true. And as extra evidence to that, when we've used another spray reagent on this, we do find that we have alkaloids in this area. So certainly there are alkaloids present.
So there are definitely alkaloids there.
The presence of ergot alkaloids means the poisons had definitely entered his bloodstream.
The fact that this alkaloid was absorbed into the gut lining itself would suggest that he would have had that symptomology. Fitting, convulsing, and behaving in a way that may well have prompted his compatriots to assume possession, bewitchment, or something of that sort, and therefore to want him executed.
Forensic science, 2,000 years on, may have found the motive for a brutal murder of ancient history. It has also offered chemical evidence to support the theory that ergot poisoning has been misinterpreted as bewitchment for centuries. Professor Capparel's theory was no longer just speculation. She had built a strong case from the Salem trial records, but so far there was only limited evidence that ergot could ravage an entire community. What she needed was unambiguous evidence from our time. The lead came for Professor Capparel when she was browsing in a bookstall at a local market.
Just by chance, I found a book. It was about a case in France where the entire village had also been afflicted with ergot poisoning.
Like a medieval plague, stalking through the towns and villages of Europe, a strange malady that sends people mad has hit Pont Saint-Esprit in France. The streets are as quiet as the death that threatens its inhabitants. And the cause, poisoned bread from this deserted baker's shop.
It was August 1951 when an unsuspecting baker used a sack full of contaminated flour to make the daily batch of bread for this small town in Provence. 200 people were struck down by a mystery disease which would see several people carted off to hospitals and psychiatric asylums in the weeks to come.
My husband went to the bakery to get a little more bread because we didn't have enough. The first thing that happened, we started to be sick and to have stomach cramps. For everybody, it was the same thing. You couldn't catch a wink. You couldn't get to sleep.
I was working at the mayor's office, and in the morning, when I arrived, no one spoke of anything else. Then during the day, we heard about a man who had a rifle, and he wanted to shoot at anything that moved, because he thought he was having hallucinations.
Doctors and scientists were drafted in from every major city in the area. Ambulances were commandeered, and the mayor's office became an emergency headquarters for the town. This is original film footage from the time. Here, only 50 years ago, were the violent convulsions seen in Salem and in Britain. The same pin-pricking sensations like thousands of insects crawling under the skin. And once again, terrifying hallucinations. In Pont Saint-Esprit, there was an eyewitness account of those nightmare visions that for centuries were interpreted as bewitchment.
Oh, snakes! I'm frightened of snakes, especially snakes. I kept thinking that there was a snake in my bed. So I would say to my aunt, "Look, Auntie, I think there is a snake in my bed." There were monkeys, bears, all sorts of things like that, and tigers, which would come into my bedroom. Not to be able to fall asleep is just horrible.
The sick had to be strapped down onto their beds as they were plagued by visions of fire, blood dripping from the ceilings, and wild animals.
In order to escape from these animals, they would open up the windows and jump out. And there was a lady who was in hospital, and she was about 75 years old, and she opened her window, and suddenly she leapt out. But she didn't die. You see, her night dress got caught on a vine, a creeping vine. That's what saved her. But in the end, she did die from the bread poisoning.
The lady in the hospital was not the only one. Soon the town was rocked by the news that at least 4 others had died. Not just the old. One was a fit 25-year-old man.
I had some friends who'd come to stay at our house. We'd eaten just a little, you know. Then they got sick too, because they'd eaten the same bread in my house, this cursed bread. They left here, and later both of them died. They got sick, and both of them died, the husband and the wife.
As the death toll increased, so did the sense of panic. People wanted answers. Chemical tests had been ordered in Marseille, but rumors were going round that the town's bread supply had been laced with arsenic or mercury. Finally, a result came through. Ergot poisoning. There was another echo of witchcraft in the little French town. People here were not willing to accept what science had to say. Even in the 20th century, they sought a supernatural explanation. Some believed the bakery was possessed by the devil. The Bishop of Nîmes was called in to exorcise the premises.
Had the events in France occurred in the 1600s instead of the 1900s, I suspect every house in the village would have been exorcised. If religion provides an explanation, if the idea that there's a devil, and that devil is the thing that is the cause of these completely extraordinary events, then an exorcism seems to me like a perfectly reasonable thing to expect people to do.
She hardly needed more convincing, but there was one final piece of evidence from France which pointed to ergot being the real evil in Salem. It was the story of a dog which had been fed scraps of bread contaminated with the ergot poison.
The dog began running around in ever-widening circles and began gnashing on rocks and broke off teeth as he was chewing on these rocks, and his mouth was bleeding. Finally, the dog died, and blood caked around his mouth. It was just a ghastly account of a dog, and that was it was an incredible moment because suddenly it made sense of one of the events in Salem that had bothered me for a long time.
What happened to the dog in France had an exact parallel in Salem. A witch cake, a piece of bread soaked in the urine of one of the sick girls, was fed to a dog to test if it too would be bewitched. Hours later, the first accusations of witchcraft were made.
Until that point, the lid had been kept on witchcraft. People had been denying it, rejecting the idea that witchcraft could be the cause. But that experiment was the turning event. And if that dog in Salem behaved anything like that dog in France, it's very easy to see how suddenly people decide this is witchcraft, and that's the explanation. The test had been made, and the test had confirmed it.
People for centuries have turned to the supernatural to explain what frightens them most. In the Middle Ages, when people were struck down with a horrific illness that tormented them with visions of wild beasts and wrenched their bodies with violent convulsions, it was witchcraft that provided the explanation. Now the real devil behind bewitchment may have been found. Ergot, the natural fungus from which the hallucinogenic drug LSD is derived. Its poisons are so powerful they can induce the hideous symptoms that time and time again have acted as a trigger for waves of executions in Salem, across Europe, and in Britain. On Gallows Hill in Salem, the spot where 19 innocent men and women were hanged for witchcraft, their deaths now seem especially futile.
It's a desolate area in many ways. It must have been at that point in time. I can imagine children, even dogs. I can imagine babies crying, so that there is this place where normal life meets up with life at its most abnormal and strange. And I can imagine people feeling self-righteous, people feeling that they have freed the community of danger. And in a sense, I'm glad to see that there's a baseball field and a playground within sight of here, a place where there's life in sight of this place of death.